just came out of my mouth. Well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight for our last e-conference from our isolation series. This one is a beauty science panel on the topic of clean beauty, and I'm really excited to be with some of my favorite influencers, beauty sci-commers in this space. I mean, favorite to me. So first is Dr. Anke Ginzburg. She completed her PhD in analytical pharmaceutical chemistry in collaboration with the Nivea Skin Research Institute. She's had many roles throughout her career, including active ingredient extraction, testing, quality assurance, formulation development, and scientific communication management. And outside of her work, she also manages a really great SciComm platform at Dr. Ginza. Dr. Michelle Wong is a science educator and content creator at Lab Muffin Beauty Science. Drawing on her chemistry PhD and extensive experience in education, she busts beauty myths and explains the science behind popular beauty products in an easy-to-understand way through her blog, YouTube channel, and Instagram. And finally, Dr. Aegean Chan is a double board-certified dermatologist, dermatopathologist, that's a mouthful, and an adjunct professor. She's an advocate of minimalist, evidence-based, and effective skincare. And she, too, also has a really great SciComm platform on her Instagram page as well as on her blog. And I guess my first question to you guys is, what do you think about the clean beauty movement? And is this productive or counterproductive in the cosmetic space? Who wants to start this? Anke, do you want to start?
Right. Well, I think the clean, well, let's put it in inverted commas, the clean beauty movement probably started with good intentions, probably trying to push the industry to do better, which is something that I think we can do. I think there's space for the beauty industry to do better in various areas, not the same around the globe. I think some things are already moving faster in some areas, in some countries. However, I think it has taken a little bit of a turn into what I nowadays would call nonsense, or it's probably, you know, gone a little bit beyond what would make sense in terms of the messaging that's put out there, in terms of claims that are being made, in terms of misinformation that's circulating in respect to the safety of products. And I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of specifics associated with certain ingredients. The biggest problem that I personally have, and why the clean beauty movement has become one of my pet peeves, if you want, is the fact that we really don't have a definition for what clean means. So there's really nothing that we can apply as a standard globally and say, this is a clean beauty product, this is a clean formula. And as a result of that, a lot of different brands and different companies and even individuals come up with their own definition of what clean means, which makes the situation even more confusing. That is my initial thought on it. I have plenty more thoughts on it, but maybe somebody else wants to chime in.
And I second what Anke has said about it. You know, I think initially the intent behind it is good. We all want to know that what we're putting on our skin and exposing our body to will not impact our health in any harmful way. I think that we all agree that that's a good thing. But again, it's kind of evolved into this culture of misinformation, and these pieces of misinformation are being passed along. And there's become a lot of pseudoscience around it. And my biggest issue with the clean beauty movement and its kind of attachment to the wellness movement in general is that there's so much fear mongering in it. And it's kind of disguised as like a wolf in sheep's clothing as, oh, this is good for you. But underlying it is this kind of insidious self-blame culture where, you know, you're giving people more anxiety that they're causing their body harm, that they're harming their family by buying certain products. And then that one step further, people feel enormous amount of guilt when something bad happens to them. Somebody that they know gets cancer, there's a rash, you know, whatever bad health outcome has occurred to this person gets attributed back onto, well, I made poor decisions when I was buying products or what I was putting on. And that to me is really what bothers me the most, is that, you know, you really can't control a lot of these health outcomes, but they make it seem like with your positive energy and buying clean that you can actually affect that. And it just has become this feedback loop that feeds into itself.
Michelle, would you like to chime in?
Oh yeah. Yeah. By the way, apologies if my internet is garbage. I'm in Australia and all our internet is garbage. So I think, yeah, I agree with Anke and Aegean. Yeah, basically the end they're trying to get to, the result is like, I think a good thing, and I think it's a universal thing. We all want to use safe beauty products, but I think they're just horribly misinformed as to how to get there. And like fundamentally, it just doesn't work because toxicology. I think they just don't understand toxicology, which is weird because toxicology is the exact thing that addresses this. So like basic things like how much of an ingredient causes toxicity is just completely ignored. And this is like the first thing you learn in toxicology. It's literally the first lecture. So yeah, I think it's really frustrating, but I do think it's just an evolution of something that's been there for a long time. It's just turned into a much more catchy marketing message now. Like the EWG has existed for ages. The dirty, like these dirty lists, these toxic lists, email forwards about like looking for SLS and your hair shampoos and stuff like that. All of this has been around for decades. It's just, yeah, gelled into this movement that has really gotten catchy in the last couple of years.
So just so everyone in the comments know, we will be taking questions towards the end. So hold your questions, or you can actually start submitting your questions. James is in the comments, so he'll be sending them my way. My next question is directed at Anke. So in this movement, there's been a lot of dialogue pertaining to the safety of ingredients. Lumped in, there's a perception that cosmetic ingredients aren't regulated, or the cosmetics industry in general isn't regulated. And in the USA, as an example, you'll often hear brands proclaim that regulations haven't changed since 1938. Is the industry regulated effectively? Are products in the USA less safe than other regions? And should consumers be worried about the safety of their products?
So, which one to answer first? In general, there are good regulatory programs in place around the globe when it comes to consumer products, especially cosmetics, because they are such an integral part of the daily routine of a lot of consumers. Especially in Europe, there are very tight regulations when it comes to cosmetic products and the safety of ingredients and the amounts that are allowed in different products, and also different formulation types and product formats. Especially in the US, there is the perception that the market is the wild, wild west, and that there is no regulation whatsoever, or no regulation improvement. So you were alluding to this myth that is making the rounds, that cosmetics regulations haven't been updated. So just to clarify, that is not true. Regulations are updated, and there is new amendments being processed and implemented on a regular basis. That everybody who's interested in that can look that up on the respective web pages. I'm sure we can share them later on. I know you have shared links in the past. What hasn't been updated, or what hasn't been fundamentally changed in terms of regulations in North America, is the framework. that the regulations for cosmetics are tied into, and that isn't not necessarily something that has to happen, and it doesn't automatically mean that regulations aren't updated. It just means that the framework that has been put in place is still the same, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The way how regulations and safety regulations differ around the globe is that different, and we had a brief chat about this, so I'm probably taking that question away from Aegean right now because she was asking that. And the way how those safety regulations differ is that some countries take different approaches when it comes to the safety assessment. So some countries have a more risk-based approach, and other countries have a hazard-based approach. The European Union, for example, has a very elaborate list as part of the European safety regulation, or the European cosmetics regulation, that lists all of the ingredients that are not allowed to be used as cosmetic ingredients. Whereas, and that's a very, very long list, whereas in North America, the actual list of ingredients that are not supposed to be used in cosmetics isn't spelled out. So I know there's people out there that say the list in Europe of ingredients that are forbidden is so and so many thousands long, and in the US it's only so and so many. I don't remember from the top of my head what the number is that people are talking about. Does any of you ladies remember?
I think it's 400 versus 11, something like that.
Right. So it's a very big difference. And the reason for that is that the US is taking a more common sense approach when it comes to what should go into a cosmetic product or not. But that doesn't mean that cosmetic products are necessarily less safe in America. Both have the prerequisite that anything that goes onto the market has to be safe.
And I guess we were having this discussion before we got started. I think it's important to understand where potentially risks would be, because there are maybe some ways that I think with respect to testing criteria, products could be more strictly regulated. And I don't know if that's even right, so maybe I won't say strictly regulated, but the bar for entry, this is something that I hear a lot of consumers talk about. It's products aren't approved when they enter the market. I think a lot of the concern, though, people don't realize it's mostly with some of the smaller brands, and like, don't stop supporting smaller brands, but a lot of the safety concerns aren't coming from the brands that you think they're coming from. Anke, would you like to chime in a bit further on this topic?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the misconception could potentially be that, you know, big beauty is the same as big pharma, and that it's lobbied, and that it's an industry that's trying to get you, or that's trying to poison you for some reason. And that's not necessarily the case. What we were discussing earlier on also, and what we've been talking about on other occasions, is that the big companies, as opposed to some smaller brands, tend to have cosmetic scientists that really know what they're doing. They have big teams of regulatory support and people that are looking after the safety assessment. Some smaller brands have a higher risk of, you know, simply for manpower reasons, or for not having the same sum of experience that some of the big R&D teams are bringing with them, that they simply can miss you know, important bits during the development process. And I'm not trying to bash small brands here, absolutely not. What we're talking about here is, you know, somebody making a batch at home in their kitchen using their frying pan and then selling it on a farmer's market. I'm not talking about indie brands. So I think, as a rule of thumb, if there is something like that, if products are coming from, you know, from a reputable brand, that works with scientists, formulators, chemists that know what they're doing, that have professional safety assessors like toxicologists or pharmacologists, and that produce their safety dossier and that also do their consumers testing. There's really nothing to fear from your cosmetics products.
So perhaps in contrast to some of the fears some of our listeners may have, but if you have any questions, then submit them into the comments. And so if you have questions on this topic, then we'll be happy to answer as we move into the Q&A period. And my next question is for Aegean. So there's an assumption that much of what we apply topically is absorbed into the bloodstream, and some figures I've read online range from 60 to 100% of the products absorb in this fashion. Is this aligned with reality?
Definitely not. I don't even think water has that rate of absorption in the skin. And the reason why is because there seems to be this perception that because we can see our skin, it has the same permeability as other common materials, like a piece of cotton or a piece of paper. But actually the skin, for everybody here knows that it's really, really highly evolved, and its main function is to keep harmful organisms out of our body. It's the first line, and it's evolved over thousands of years to be really, really good at its job of keeping things out. So we don't want bacteria, we don't want fungi, we don't want allergens to get into our skin, into our body, and activate our immune system, cause infection, etc. So I'm just going to kind of briefly review the biology of the outer layer of the skin. So the epidermis is the topmost layer of the skin, and the topmost layer of the epidermis is called the stratum corneum. And I like to think of it like a brick wall. So the bricks are the dead skin cells, or the corneocytes. And then between those corneocytes is something called the lipid bilayer that's essentially like mortar. So it's made out of lipids as well as proteins, enzymes, and they're cross-linked, and they do a really, really good job of keeping things out. And in terms of absorption through the skin, so obviously we do prescribe medications and creams that are applied to the skin. But it really depends on what the molecule is. So the rate of absorption is correlated to what the structure of the molecule is. So things that are more lipophilic tend to have an easier time absorbing, as well as molecules that are much smaller have an easier time of absorbing through the skin, there's a couple different pathways, and I won't dive into that. But it's important to remember that there's a whole sector of research that's devoted to transdermal delivery of medications, and they still haven't cracked the code. We wouldn't need to give injections for things if the skin was so permeable. We would be able to apply Botox topically. I wouldn't have to inject numbing medication using a needle. I should be able to do everything topically if the skin was as permeable and everything we put on was absorbed 60 to 100%. And I just wanted to give, before I dive into some examples, so it's really important to remember the difference between absorption and harm. And this kind of ties into what Michelle was talking about with regards to just basic understanding of toxicology. Just because something is absorbed into our body does not mean that is harmful to us. And for a lot of the things, like especially with regards to sunscreen ingredients, we don't have any data in humans that have shown long-lasting harmful effects. And often these ingredients that are absorbed, even if you have absorption to the bloodstream, get metabolized very quickly, within hours often. So either through the urine, feces, or the liver. I was looking through some of the literature. So oxybenzone, one of the sunscreen ingredients, they've done controlled studies where they had research subjects apply it all over their body at a density of 2 milligrams per centimeter of a 10% solution. And they found that there was about a 2% rate of absorption. So that's pretty low and pretty different from the figures that you've read online. And then in terms of like something like tretinoin, so that's something that we're putting on retinoids or putting on our skin, you know, long-term use, it's about 1 to 2% absorption. So just to give people a sense of like common medications and common things we're putting on our skin, what the rate of absorption is. And then with parabens, again, that gets really rapidly excreted, and that the absorption of that depends on the structure, the chemical structure of the molecule and the vehicle that it's in. And so, you know, as a dermatologist, we have to kind of work around how impermeable the skin is to try to get medication to our patients, especially people that have like psoriasis, atopic dermatitis. You know, you can't really take a pill. Sometimes you can take a pill for it, but often we also have to treat it topically as well. And so we have to kind of trick the system by using occlusives. So we know that when you occlude the skin, it does become more permeable. When you wet the skin, it does become more permeable. So we use tricks like that to try to bypass how impermeable the skin is. So that's my long answer for your question.
And the short answer, no. 60 to 100% of ingredients.
Very unrealistic.
I think if I may chime in really quickly, I think part of that perception is that when you're applying a product, it disappears, it goes somewhere, right? So people put products all over themselves and then they go somewhere. So naturally, people are worried that they might actually be absorbed into their body, not just into the outer layers of their skin. And I had an interesting conversation the other day about the microbiome with somebody, and we were talking about what is actually inside of you and what's actually outside of you. And this person was actually suggesting that your stratum corneum and partly to that extent your epidermis actually belong to the outside world and not necessarily to you. So just because something gets absorbed into your stratum corneum, it really doesn't mean that it's inside of you. If you think about the fact that you're also, you know, shedding off your stratum corneum continuously, the fact that an ingredient gets absorbed into it from your skincare product, just because you see it disappear from the surface, it doesn't mean it's on the inside of you. It's just invisible for you to the moment.
Right, and you have to remember. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Michelle.
Sorry, no. Oh, I was just going to say a lot of most products is water, and a lot of that evaporates. And yeah, we don't think about that. Anyway, yes, you go.
Well, I was just going to say understanding the anatomy of the skin. So just Googling epidermis really is helpful for a visual to actually see how complex the skin is, even though.
I have
Oh, beautiful. 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 I should get one of those. So you see the blood vessels are near the bottom, kind of close to the fat, that yellow layer at the bottom, those are your blood vessels. So, you know, really that's the important part, is if something gets down into your blood vessels, that's when you start to get more absorption. But it takes a lot for a molecule to pass through all of those layers, you know, not just the stratum corneum, but the entire epidermis, across the basal layer, through the dermis. And as a dermatologist, like, you know, people with hyperpigmentation disorders, often the pigment is much deeper in the dermis, beyond the epidermis. And we don't treat those with creams. Creams are pretty ineffective for those types of diseases. So it's pretty difficult to get things to absorb through your bloodstream, through the skin. Thanks for that. That's awesome.
And my next question is for Michelle. So what are your thoughts of the popular free from claims that seem to be everywhere on skincare?
I think it's really misleading. I think one of the problems with free from claims is there's an argument that consumers have the right to know what their product doesn't contain. The problem with that is that if you see a free from label and you're not entirely read up on this, I mean, not all of us spend hours obsessing over it and researching it. If you see that on the label, you automatically assume, oh, that must be a bad thing. Why else would a company tell me that their product is free from a particular ingredient? And there's been studies done on this in the context of genetically modified organisms, GMOs, and GMO labeling. So even though most people don't know what a GMO is, they still have the perception that it's bad because they've seen these labels. The problem is a company can claim anything on their label a lot of the time. So in the EU, they've started regulating this slightly, but at the moment, I believe it is still a suggestion, a guideline rather than a rule. So for example, some nail polishes claim that they're free from parabens. Now, nail polishes are nasty in terms of what's in them for bacteria. They're fine for us, but they are made of solvent. Solvents do not survive, like they kill bacteria. Bacteria have never survived well in ethyl acetate, which is the main ingredient in nail polish. But they still claim free from parabens, which are preservatives that would never have been put into nail polish before because they're just not necessary. So yeah, so for example, if I have water, I can say it's free from, I don't know, radium, free from cyanide. And then you would see that on your bottle of water and you would think, why does every other bottle of water not claim this? They must contain cyanide. So it's a clever marketing trick, but a lot of the time that claim just isn't necessary and it leads to this fear because like parabens, like most people don't know what they are. Yeah, so I mentioned that the EU has put out a guideline explicitly saying this is misleading and you are not allowed or you should not claim that a product is free from an ingredient that never would have been put in there. But this is still a guideline. It is still widely done throughout the industry. You have products that say they're free from ingredients that, yeah, firstly aren't harmful and secondly were never put in there in the first place.
Anke, do you want to chime in a bit more on this topic? I know you and I have had some conversations about those the recommendations that Michelle was bringing up.
Yeah, so I think the technical guidance was issued in 2018 as a draft, and some countries are actually reinforcing it already. So what's still a bit vague is the harmonization across the European Union, but it is consensus that ingredients that are not harmful or for which there hasn't really been any reason for not using them, they shall not be denigrated by communicating that they're not in a formula. And at the same time, also in Europe, it's definitely not allowed to claim mere compliance with the law. So, for example, ingredients that are by default not allowed to go into products, they can't be called out. So it's not allowed in the EU to say this product is safe because it's a regulatory prerequisite that products are safe when they're put on the market. And also it's not allowed to be misleading. So there's the six common criteria for claims. And one aspect of the six common criteria is that basically you shouldn't be misleading. And of course, there's a little bit of wiggle room there, whether or not that is something misleading or not. When you say that a certain ingredient that you wouldn't have put in a formula in the first place is not in there. I know some companies have stricter policies than others. So for example, as Michelle used the example of nail polish, there's other products that you wouldn't have certain ingredients in. For example, you wouldn't necessarily find a foaming agent in a lipstick. So to claim that your lipstick doesn't contain SLS doesn't make any sense at all. And there's the companies that are a bit more strict in their claims policies that say, no, that doesn't make any sense from the get-go, so we're not even going to make that claim. And then there's other companies that, they probably don't take that common criteria of not being misleading too seriously, which is one thing that I find in general generally quite frustrating, that some companies take the rules stricter than others. But yeah, the whole claims topic is probably an entirely different conversation that could fill up an entire evening, I guess.
So I guess just to break down some of the common free from claims, so some of the popular ones include free from silicones, parabens, SLS, chemical sunscreens, ethoxylated materials. So just to break down some of these misconceptions, I thought we could kind of dive into the safety profile of these ingredients, and maybe we can start with Michelle. You've done a lot of writing on silicones and sunscreens, so can you take us through this topic?
All right, so silicones. This is really big because there are many, many different types of silicones. All of them are different. Some of them evaporate off your skin. Some of them stay on your skin. I think the general ideas that the clean beauty movement puts forward about silicones, firstly, they suffocate your skin. No, firstly, some of them evaporate. So for example, cyclopentasiloxane, cyclic silicones, those are commonly used in products to help the product spread, and they evaporate after you've applied the product. So obviously they evaporate. They cannot possibly be suffocating your skin because they're gone in like 30 seconds. With the ones that stay on your skin, those also don't suffocate your skin. Firstly, your skin does not breathe. It cannot really be suffocated. A lot of the time, if anything, you want to suffocate your skin a little bit. So for example, petroleum jelly, that is a fantastic occlusive. It is the thing that is the thickest, ingredient in skincare that can keep water from evaporating. That is generally a good thing. So water is constantly evaporating from your skin, and if that happens too much, then you end up with things like dry skin, flaking, stuff like that. So so it does suffocate your skin, and suffocating your skin isn't necessarily a bad thing because your skin is not your lungs. What else is there? Environmental impact is another thing. With the environmental impact, again, there are so many different silicones that it's hard to make any big generalizations. There are some silicones that have been found to have a greater environmental impact. So, for example, some of the cyclic silicones, like the ones with 4 carbons. So those have been, there's been limits put on those. The EU, I believe, is in the process of phasing them out. And most companies, if they're phasing it out of one place, they will also phase it out of other places too, because it's much easier to produce the same formula across different countries. So there's been some regulations on them, but again, silicones there's so many different silicones, you can't just generalize silicones, which is what the clean beauty movement does. There's also the idea that they're not biodegradable, which I think is mostly to do with the fact that the word biodegradable is very differently used in science compared to in everyday life. So in everyday life, if we think of something as non-biodegradable, we think that it's something like polyethylene, a plastic that might not break down in the environment for thousands of years. But in science, biodegradability is usually limited to a few months or a few years. If it doesn't break down in like 4 months in some studies, it counts as non-biodegradable. So I think that's where some of it comes from. And yeah, silicones do break down in the environment. It's just that in these studies, they say non-biodegradable. And a lot of people from the clean beauty movement, they will see that study, they will read the abstract, and then they'll see the word did not degrade. And then they put that into, they take that away from that. The other thing is biodegradable has the word bio in it. And what that means is something that will break down, be broken down by a living organism. And that's not the only way that things can degrade. So, sorry, I think I said they were biodegradable. Sorry, they are not biodegradable, but they are degradable, which means they break down in the environment because of the sun, because they touch, I believe, clays, break them down from memory. Yeah, so they still break down, just not via bacteria eating them up. So that was my very long-winded thing on silicones. The other one you mentioned was chemical sunscreens. So chemical sunscreens, the main concern is, like Aegean mentioned before, there have been some studies where it's been absorbed, but again, absorption does not mean toxicity. Just because something is absorbed and detected in your blood doesn't mean it's doing harm. There are lots of things in blood that do not harm us. Yeah, so firstly, there's that. Secondly, I think Aegean mentioned that oxybenzone in a particular study had 2% absorption. I think people assume that means 2% of 100%, when in reality it's 2% of however much you applied. I also believe that in the 2% study, it was a solution that was like not like a real sunscreen.
No.
So
it was 10%, and normally it's 6% or below, I believe.
Yeah, and usually it's not a solution either. So in sunscreens, a lot of the time they're formulated to stay on your skin, because if they're absorbed into your skin, they're not protecting you. They're not between you and the sun. So they're formulated to stay in a layer on the skin. So the absorption, I believe in the recent FDA studies for, I think I calculated it for avobenzone, and it's something like 0.0011%. Like, it's ridiculously low for real sunscreens because they're formulated specially, and these are used in really low concentrations. Yeah, so in terms of the potential harms of chemical sunscreens, firstly, there's tons of different chemical sunscreens. You can't just generalize all of them. Secondly, even if they're absorbed and detected in the bloodstream, they don't necessarily cause harm. So the FDA studies were based on detecting them in blood. There is also the fact that they're endocrine disruptors, and what that means is that they cause hormonal changes. And there's, like, it sounds really scary, but a lot of things are endocrine disruptors, and they are okay. So for example, the oral contraceptive pill, that is pure hormones. That is straight up hormones that are meant to have a hormonal effect on you. And tons of people use these, and they've been associated with increased and decreased risks of some cancers, but like, they are like millions of times stronger than the things you'd find in cosmetics, because they're absorbed better and they are purposely made for that purpose. Yeah, so there are tons of endocrine disruptors in everyday life, and not all of them are necessarily bad. Tofu has hormonal components as well, and the amount that you get from that will actually cause biological effects. Sunscreens have been used for decades, and they've been used by most of the population at some point. And the thing is, we have never found a lasting health effect from them. And so you'd think that if we've used them for so long, we would have found something by now. And I think that is sort of an aspect that's been missing from the clean beauty conversation. Like, the fact that these things have been used for ages, and if there was something bad about them, you'd think it would be more obvious by now, because we are looking for these effects as well. Sorry, that was quite long-winded. Hopefully that made sense to someone.
Well, there's also the aspect... Oh, I just wanted to ask, though, there's also the aspect that I often hear talked about, that chemical or organic sunscreens, they kill coral reefs, and that's why we should stop using them. So what does the body of evidence show us right now for that?
There has not been a single study since the last time I looked, and the last time I looked was well after all of the regulations were put in place in, like, Hawaii and Palau. There has not been evidence that it has actually affected a coral reef ever. There is one of the top coral reef scientists in the world, Terry Hughes, who is Australian, because we have the Great Barrier Reef here. He does a lot of amazing work on coral reefs, and he's a very strong activist for coral reefs. He constantly posts things about how the coral reefs are dying and the government is awful. Anyway, he has said sunscreen is not an issue. Stop talking about sunscreens, essentially. I've paraphrased. He's much more polite. But yeah, sunscreen is just not an issue. I believe he said if you made a list of all the threats to sunscreen, all the threats to coral reefs, sunscreen would be like number 200. By far, the biggest threat to coral reefs is global warming, as well as land management. So things like pesticides and fertilizers flowing off from farms into the water. So yeah, it's just been a tiny issue that's been hyped up. The main lab that has hyped it up, they have a like certification that they've invented, which is if you don't have particular ingredients in your sunscreen, you can get this little badge and be put onto their list. Of course, you have to pay a fee. So there is a financial incentive for them to be hyping up this research. And again, all of their research has been done on, they get a piece of coral or they get coral cells and they dump whatever chemical on it and see what happens, which is not what happens in actual coral in the world. I have very strong feelings about this.
I was just going to chime in just for a second. So I was talking to my husband about this. He's also a dermatologist and he did a year of research at Memorial Sloan Kettering, mostly on sunscreen. And he's written a couple of papers about it. And he gave me the analogy that, so looking at the rat studies in which they found uterine changes in rats that had been exposed to a maximum concentration of oxybenzone, to get that equivalent dose in humans, we would have to cover our entire body surface area every day for 35 years and never pee any of it out. So like it just helps to, because I think a lot of that data on the EWG is all extrapolations from in vitro and animal studies, and it has not been shown in human studies. So I think that's also an important thing to remember when talking about this stuff too.
I did the math one time for parabens. I don't remember the actual figures, but you would have to immerse yourself in a bathtub of body lotion and stay there 24 hours and never metabolize anything to actually also reach those concentrations that I used in the in vitro studies. So I think coming back to what Michelle said earlier, understanding concentration and basic principles of toxicology is something that is really, really important. And yeah, but one thing I see across the board in clean beauty conversations is that the factor of concentration or dose is completely missing from the conversation. There is a lot of cross the board statements like, all silicones, all parabens, all chemical or all organics, sun filters. And then beyond that, missing differentiation of which compounds, there's the principle of how much actually missing.
And another thing about that is that a lot of the time they say the US allows this chemical, but the EU has banned it. Most of the time the EU has not banned it. They've put a limit on the concentration.
And I guess,
and the US uses that concentration too in practice. Yeah, it's
some of what you brought up with respect to some of the regulatory changes for sunscreens in Hawaii, this kind of brings up a point that regulations, unfortunately, and I've had a lot of people get mad at me like, who do you think you are saying that regulations aren't science-based or whatever? They're not always based on science, and I think that's really unfortunate and maybe like a downside of clean beauty. We want to make better products, and we want to have regulations that are informed by evidence. And I guess another area related to that, because of the 1,4-dioxane bill that's just been passed, I believe, in New York, that kind of brings up ethoxylated ingredients. So this next two top ingredients that I'd like to take through would be by Anke. So it would be SLS and ethoxylated ingredients.
Sure. While we're on ethoxylated ingredients, let's continue there. So I guess a big group that people are afraid of and that people are looking for the absence of are polyethylene glycol derivatives that usually have, well, that by definition, they have an polyethoxylated moiety in their molecular structure. And PEGs are also a very, very broad group of ingredients. So just by looking for the absence of PEGs, that is a very, very broad thing to be looking for. So that would be quite undifferentiated already. PEGs are used for very many different reasons in cosmetic products. Some are surfactants, some are emulsifiers, others are simply there to enhance the sensorial profile. And I guess there's two reasons why consumers are looking for the absence of PEG derivatives. One is, as you mentioned, the potential presence of 1,4-dioxane, which is a substance that can occur during the manufacturing or during the production of PEG derivatives. And it is a potential impurity that, if not controlled properly for quality, can also be occurring in a finished cosmetic product. However, 1,4-dioxane is a potential carcinogen, which means that there is a risk potentially associated with the human exposure to it. But there is not enough data to actually classify it as a definitive carcinogen. So there's been a lot of talk about it occurring in cosmetic products. And the recent regulatory adaptation for New York sets a very specific limit of 10 ppm, which is 10 milligrams per kilogram in a cosmetic product, which is what the SCCS has determined as the safe limit for humans to be exposed to. Matter of fact is that 1,4-dioxane is very volatile. So one thing that Michelle also mentioned earlier, once it's applied to the skin, it actually evaporates and isn't necessarily absorbed. So even if, and now there is a very long cascade of even ifs. So even if your product is formulated with a PEG derivative that has been contaminated or that has a certain amount of 1,4-dioxane in it, even if that is the case, which would have to be a glitch in the manufacturing process of the raw material, even if you end up with some 1,4-dioxane in your skincare product, after applying it, the likelihood that the 1,4-dioxane from the product ends up in your skin, and then coming back to our conversation that we had earlier, permeating into your skin and being resorbed into your bloodstream is very, very, very low. So should we be afraid of 1,4-dioxane moieties in our skincare products? I think it's good to have tight regulations around it. And I think it's good that we're looking for the absence of it, but it's not necessarily something to be scared about, if you ask me.
And I just want to quickly chime in that I had a conversation with Nicholas Georges, I think that's his name. So if anyone wants a lot more detail on the regulatory changes and potentially the impacts that will happen, go tune into that podcast. But one of the take-homes is that the shift to limit 1,4-dioxane in the way that it is currently is demonstrably safe. There are like quality standards in place already. It's actually going to have a sustainability impact. So that's something that I think a lot of consumers aren't aware of, that this shift, this regulations that haven't been based on evidence might actually make our products less sustainable. And we had a comment that I would love for one of you to chime in on, that PEGs can be an issue for irritation. And this is kind of in contrast to what I understand about the how this ingredient would be, or this ingredient category, I guess, would be used in formulation. And then that it's been recommended by dermatologists to avoid PEGs for sensitive skin, and also it's a pro-penetrant. So would somebody like to chime in on that?
I'd love to, from a pro-penetrant point of view and from a, distinguishing between different types of PEGs point of view. Obviously, I can't make any dermatologist related comments because I'm not a dermatologist, so maybe we'll leave that to the dermatologist. But when we're talking about irritation potential and also penetration enhancement, that applies to a very small subset of PEG derivatives. So yes, there are PEG derivatives that can potentially be irritating, but it's wrong to say that across the board they are. They're actually very, very safe, and they have very low irritation potential. And can they be penetration enhancers? Some of them can be, that's right. Does that mean that they also make it possible for ingredients to actually reach your bloodstream? No, we've already discussed that. And I also want to throw in that actually olive oil is a much more effective penetration enhancer than some of these PEG derivatives that actually can enhance penetration. So yes, the facts that have been stated in the comment, they're true. Some PEGs have irritation potential, but it's wrong to say PEGs are irritating. And also, some PEGs can increase penetration. That's right. But to put that into perspective, not all of them do. And it doesn't mean that automatically ingredients will reach your bloodstream. And at the same time, some lipids, like for example, olive oil or other fatty acids, they are much more potent penetration enhancers. So I think, yes, it's right, but it needs to be taken in context.
And maybe before you start talking about SLS, which is the next thing that I wanted you to chime in on, there's also the case of like ethoxylation there with SLES, sodium lauryl sulfate, where that ethoxylation actually makes the surfactant a bit more gentle. So just to put it out there. But would you like to take us through the safety profile of SLS and maybe some of the misinformation floating around?
Sure, yeah. I mean, SLS, I think the reason why it's been landing in the bad corner or on the nasty list is that SLS as a pure substance is used for irritation testing as a benchmark, or also to induce a barrier disruption. So if we want to, in a clinical model, assess barrier repair, the way to disrupt the barrier prior to the actual repair testing in a very effective way is using SLS under an occlusion patch. So SLS is very, very effective if you want to irritate the skin, if you use it at 100% or at a high concentration. So extrapolating from that, I think a lot of consumers think that SLS is a very, very irritating substance. And we're coming back to something that we've been talking about over and over again. It all comes down to concentration. So SLS is used in rinse-off products as a foaming agent, as a surfactant, and it is very, very effective at that. So in a rinse-off product, the concentration that actually is left on your skin after you've used it, by definition, it's a rinse-off product, so you'll rinse it off your skin. The concentration of surfactant that's actually staying on your skin is very, very low. So for some people who have dry skin, using a very defattening or very effective surfactant obviously can contribute to exacerbate a dry skin condition. And I'm sure Aegean has a lot more to say about that. But in a right formula combined with humectants and emollients, and that also applies to shower gels, SLS can actually be formulated into a very, very mild product that is suitable even for sensitive skin. So the newest and to me most surprising recent discovery that I made is that people now are looking for SLS-free toothpaste. Because it's also used as a foaming agent, because and also because it is so safe and so gentle in the right concentration, you can even use it in oral care. And concentration that can lead to irritation would start at 5% and above. and the concentration for SLS that you would use in oral care would be way below that. So I lost my train of thoughts there for a second. Bear with me, it's nearly 1 a.m.
Just something I wanted to add to the SLS thing and the formulation thing that Anke just talked about. There's also the fact that if you can, so one of the reasons that SLS is quite irritating is that it forms small micelles that can get into your skin quite easily. So these are when the SLS bunches together and after you mix it with water, it forms into little like bubble-like groups that are quite small. If you actually mix it with other surfactants in the product, then they bunch together and they form a bigger cluster. And so that will penetrate the skin a lot less than a smaller cluster. And I think, yeah, this is completely missing from this sort of free from talk. Like if you follow the guidelines that these free from organizations tell you to do, you will just simply look at your product and go, oh, there's SLS, I better not use it. But it never asks you, like, is there another surfactant in this product that would make the SLS less irritating? Are they humectants and emollients like Anke mentioned? Yeah, so I think the combination of ingredients is also completely missing from this conversation. Yeah.
And then before we move on to that, I know we haven't been really targeting this at sulfates. This was supposed to be about ethoxylated ingredients. But the conversation from SLS has moved on to sulfate-free. And now people are looking for the absence of sulfate. And sulfate in itself is a moiety that is used a lot biochemically in your entire system. Actually, your liver uses sulfate to make substances that have entered your body more eliminatable via your urine. So actually your liver attaches sulfate to a lot of substances that pass through your liver to detox your body. And just throwing that in, that is the only way your body detoxes via the liver, the kidneys, partly the skin. Yeah, sorry, I'm deviating. Let's not get into the detox discussion. But so the whole demonization of sulfates came kind of piggybacking into the clean beauty movement on the back of SLS, which in itself didn't really deserve the bad press that it got to start with.
And I guess the ingredient that everyone thinks about when they think about harmful ingredients, I guess that's what marketing tells you is going to kill you, parabens. So Aegean, would you like to take us through the safety of parabens?
Yes, but before I dive into parabens specifically, just this whole discussion about irritancy versus allergic contact dermatitis and dermatologist recommendations from the clinical side. And this has come up in the past couple of weeks a lot, just through posts and comments, is really trying to understand the difference between an irritant reaction and a true allergic contact dermatitis. So a true allergic contact dermatitis, where you actually are diagnosed through patch testing at a physician's office, and you have a true sensitization where your body actually recognizes that specific allergen as an unfriendly foe and will attack it and cause a rash. That is very rare. Most of the reactions we see to personal care products specifically are often irritant reactions, which are dose dependent. You don't have to have a specific allergy to that. So your immune system is not programmed against that specific ingredient. So kind of like what Anke was saying about the SLS, if you put enough of it on, it will irritate your skin and you'll have a non-specific reaction. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And I think that the hypoallergenic labeling also kind of contributes to this misconception around allergy and skin reaction. So basically, anytime you have a rash on your skin, it doesn't mean you have a specific allergy to something. So, and when Jen was saying, dermatologists may be recommending to avoid PEGs, in my practice, unless you have a demonstrable allergy to something where you've been previously diagnosed and you have this recurrent rash to the same product and we can kind of zero in on the ingredient, that's when I recommend, you should avoid that ingredient, because we've shown that that's the thing that triggers your rash. But for people that have normal barrier function, don't have underlying atopic dermatitis or eczema, most products, especially drugstore products, are really well tolerated. So back to parabens. So obviously it's a bad word, I guess, in beauty. And one of the biggest reasons why is that it is and considered an endocrine disruptor. And I'm not going to dive in too deeply into this, but it's pretty much the same concept where, they've, in animal studies and in vitro studies, they've shown that it has some estrogenic potential. But what's important to remember is that actually, once you put it on the skin or even ingest it, there are enzymes in our skin and in our liver that rapidly metabolize it to something called p-hydroxybenzoic acid that is much, much less estrogenic than even the estrogen present naturally in our bodies, as well as the estrogens that are found in oral contraceptives and the phytoestrogens found in our food, tofu, soy milk, etc. So, the amount of exposure we're getting from the skin, I mean, there's a very, very low percentage that's actually being absorbed. And even once it's absorbed, it gets inactivated and excreted very, very rapidly. So bottom line, there's no evidence that in humans, it has caused any long-term endocrine irregularities or disruptions. There's also a cancer concern. And again, there are some studies that have shown they found parabens within tumors, but there's no data to kind of show that it's actually the paraben that directly led to the development of these cancerous cells and development of these mutations. So there's no strong data showing that causation relationship. And then the last thing that I find that I hear most often is that it is an allergen. It's can cause irritant type reactions, and it's such an old preservative that we've used for so long. We have such great data, and actually the rate of allergic contact dermatitis is the lowest of almost all the preservatives out there on the market. So it's between the studies show between 0.5 and 1.4 is the numbers that I've read. And to put that in perspective, a lot of people are replacing parabens with isothiazolinones or MCIs, and that is a much higher rate of allergenicity of 4%. So it has been vilified, but again, the North American Contact Dermatitis Society has voted it, I think in the past 5 to 10 years, twice the non-allergen of the year. So it is unfairly maligned, and it's very, very safe, and we don't want to get Pseudomonas ulcers on our cornea from contaminated mascara. So it's good to have preservatives in our products. And I think that parabens are a very good one. And, there are a small percentage of patients that have a true allergy to it, but I don't think that we should be using blanket statements, and especially companies should not be capitalizing off of the fears of consumers.
Now, I just wanted to bring up a point that I've been asked quite a few times. So this idea of why don't we just switch to something else? If we still have more to learn about parabens, if we're not super sure that it's safe, then why don't we just switch to potassium sorbate or whatever preservative, phenoxyethanol or whatever? Make that switch, which I feel like people are under the assumption that would be the cautious approach. Just like a disclaimer, one has a lot of evidence, probably the most rigorously tested ingredient used in cosmetics with thousands of studies to support the safety, just to put my own opinion forward. And then another doesn't have as much evidence. But I guess with that, what do you guys think of that idea of what's the problem with just switching to something else that we can feel more confident about?
Yeah, I think that.
Go, Michelle. Go.
You go. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of people just don't think about the fact that we know tons about parabens. Like they have been the most studied preservatives, I would say. Um, Whereas all the new ones that we are looking at, like the fact that we don't know much about them at all and they haven't been used for very long, that's kind of like the reason they're dangerous. So sorry, I'm a medicinal chemist. So like the analogy I always think of is with illicit drugs. Like LSD is super, super safe. Like you cannot overdose on LSD. But because people are like, ooh, like I've heard that it's bad, then there are lots of people who use research chemicals instead. And these are drugs that people haven't really tested for as long as LSD. LSD's been around since like before the 60s. And every time you see people dying from LSD in the media, it is actually one of these new drugs that have very, very little like very little studies, very little people who have used them throughout the years. Like they do not have a long history of safe use. Same thing with preservatives, parabens. We know enough about them, and like we've heard of them. People have studied them. We know their risks, and people just point to the risk and they go, "Ooh, that might be dangerous." And then they start introducing these new things, which we have like no data. People haven't tested them. You are basically doing an experiment on yourself rather than trusting these studies that where experiments have been done on mice, cells, things that are not you. Yeah.
I was basically going to say the same. To me, it doesn't really make any sense to switch from something that you have a lot of data on, even though, let's say, 80% of the data that you have show that it's safe, and then you have 20% of studies that really don't lead to any conclusion that point into a direction where it says, oh, we might need more data in this direction, but you're sitting on this enormous amount of studies that show safety. Why would you just discard that and go to something that you really don't have, 100 studies about? So to me, it just doesn't make any sense.
Right. And it kind of comes back to the whole issue with MCIs, how that people have been switching out to those, and there's a much, double, almost triple rate of allergic contact dermatitis reactions to that. And then also I meant to bring this up also, botanical extracts and oils. I saw one study, they found about a 6% rate of allergies to them. So just to put it in perspective, and I was telling them before we started that I see the most rashes to essential oil products that people have picked up at the local natural health food store, more so than well-formulated drugstore products that have parabens, that have SLS, and other ingredients in them.
And sorry, I'm going to bring up a question that I never told you guys I would ask, but this kind of speaks to the issue with most clean beauty certifications, where people don't realize that they're kind of formed by pseudoscience. And I guess a red flag for pseudoscience is cherry picking. They go and find this one arbitrary study that confirms their belief. They ignore the body of evidence so that they can say parabens cause breast cancer, or SLS is whatever you're finding on the EWG database. So what's wrong with that? Why should we be looking at the body of evidence when we're starting to make some of these statements about the safety of our ingredients? And I think people kind of miss why it's important to be critical of the studies that you're reading, because also taking into account the relevance. You guys have kind of brought this up, but the relevance of this, for example, animal study, it's injected, for example, at a very high percentage versus topically applied at a low percentage. So can you take us through this topic? Sorry, I didn't give you this question before.
I think one of the big issues with cherry picking is that, basically what they have done is they have gone out and found a blue car, and they have shown you the blue car, and they say, look, all cars are blue. It's not representative of all the cars out there. That one study is not representative of all the studies necessarily. Now, maybe all the cars are blue, but you can't tell that from this one car. I think that's what's missing. The fact that you don't like most of these places, they pick out a few studies, and you don't know what they're showing you is representative.
And I think it's important to kind of think about the scientific method in general. So when you think about pharmaceutical drugs, so right now we're talking a lot about medications, remdesivir, things for coronavirus, and trying to, help get to a cure. We have to think about, well, what's the process of actually getting a drug to market? You don't just have one in vitro study on cells on a plate, or maybe one animal study, and then you can release the drug to market and have humans ingest the drug and take it. It's a very controlled process with multiple phases. You have to demonstrate safety in animals before you can administer to humans, and then show efficacy in human trials. And I think that is important. If you apply that kind of same mentality to, you want to have that same type of rigorous thinking when you're talking about those studies that say, oh, well, this is dangerous to humans, you should never be exposed to it. You can't extrapolate. You have to do the direct studies before you can really come to a conclusion. And I think as a physician, it's really difficult to communicate that to patients, to people that are not necessarily in the science field, because you want to have something that's black and white. It's so much easier to grasp something that's straightforward, and it's a buzzword, and say, well, I don't want to use anything with parabens. Okay, that's what I'm going to do, and I feel good about what I'm doing. I feel like I'm doing a good thing for my body. But we all know in science and medicine, it's all nuance. Even with things that have been dogma in medicine for maybe 20 years, after enough studies, sometimes that gets overturned. So really, there's not a lot of, what am I trying to say? The foundational topics, sometimes you can even overturn them with enough data. So it's really not subjective, but it requires a lot of critical thinking, and there's a lot of nuance in the field.
One analogy I like to do is like chocolate is toxic for dogs. So things that are bad for animals in studies are not necessarily bad for humans. Like if we believe that, we would stop eating chocolate.
Right.
Does anyone want to chime in before I ask or start asking questions from the audience? Okay. Well, I could ask you questions all night. I can literally talk to you all night. But I'll start asking you some of our really excellent questions that we've received from our audience. We've received quite a few. There's a lot of engagement in the comments, so thank you everyone that's participating. So the first question that I'll ask you is from the Joggler, and so he wants to know, does clean beauty provide any benefit for customers or consumers?
Yeah, nice one, Perry.
We all know who asked that question.
Well, I think so that since there is no across-the-board definition of what clean beauty really is, I don't think there is a straight answer to that question. If we're looking at the intention of clean beauty, which is to provide educated content and make consumers feel more safe about what they're using and what they're doing. Sure, but is that what's really going on in terms of messaging? Is that what's really happening to the consumer? I don't think so. So if we're looking at what clean beauty has turned into, from a scientific point of view, I don't think it's really doing anything good in terms of really educating the consumer and helping them making informed choices. I think it's confusing them, and I think it's contributing to fear and chemophobia. Was that the initial intention? No. Is there one definition for clean beauty? No. Did that answer your question? Triple no.
I'm I'm trying to think of like a benefit, and like honestly, the only one I can think of is maybe now consumers know how to spell parabens. Like, yeah, it's really hard to think of anything positive that's come out of this.
Yeah, and it feels like it's really from the economic standpoint, it really takes advantage of the consumer as well, because I think if something's labeled as clean, you can charge a little bit more, almost like the organic food movement. And that does exclude access to clean beauty products to people that maybe are of a lower socioeconomic class. Like an example is petrolatum. In dermatology, I love it. It's the cheapest thing. You can get a tub for $3 and it works amazing for people with eczema. But if you are somebody that ascribes to the clean beauty movement, you may feel a lot of guilt about using a petrolatum product on your skin, and it may be out of your financial reach, So I think that's an issue for consumers as well, as really preys on their wallets.
I think there's one positive aspect that has come out of it, and that is that it's irritated cosmetic scientists to the degree that they're showing up on social media. So I think, to be honest with you, if this wouldn't have happened, I definitely wouldn't have. And if Michelle wouldn't have her blog, I wouldn't have started my Instagram account. But I just got so fed up with the nonsense. And also I had support from some of my marketing partners and a lot of my R&D peers that said, we need more voice out there talking sense. So from that point of view, I think it's fostering a lot of collaboration. And look at us, we have someone from the US West Coast, from the East Coast, from Europe, and from Australia. It's clearly something that's happening around the globe, which I think is a good thing. So it's fostering conversation, even if it's costing us a lot of cortisol and adrenaline, and it's really, really annoying. But that is a good thing.
Yeah, and I mean, to kind of further this question, there's this assumption that clean beauty products will be safer and they'll be more sustainable. And so, I mean, sometimes I find it's the opposite, especially in North America, where some of the smaller products or smaller brands that don't understand the regulatory rigor to launch a safe product, sometimes they don't have the minimal tests that I would say are required to launch said safe products. And then they're the ones that are going and making these claims about their products are safer and fear-mongering, yet they have a lower quality than some of the larger companies. Does anyone want to chime in on that? And also, like, just to say, I'm not saying don't support small businesses. That's not at all what I'm saying. There are a lot of very legitimate small businesses out there. But in North America, because there's no required testing, I guess, if I'll just put it out there, that's one way that I would like to see the regulations change in North America. Because of that, there are some people making products in their kitchen and then just going and putting it in Whole Foods. So what do you think about that? Oh, and then also saying that their products are safer than all the other products out there.
Maybe one thing we should do is start encouraging people to look at the product recall list and see what sorts of brands tend to be there, because I mean, that's like products that are so unsafe that the government has finally decided to step in and say, look, like, don't like bring this back. Yeah.
Does anyone want to chime in further before I ask my next question? Okay, so my next question is from Emily Watson, and so she asks, should we be concerned with certain ingredients currently allowed in lipsticks specifically? Do we know how much is ingested via the mucous membrane? Anyone?
I feel like Anke just did a post on this fairly recently.
Did I? Oh, did I?
It was about dye. It was mostly about dye.
Well, I mean, so the last question was, do we know how much is ingested? Yes, there's I don't know the figure, but there are studies that are looking at how much is on average applied with one application, what are the habits and practices of consumers in terms of reapplying during the day, how much lipstick is used over the course of a year. And there is a figure that looks at how many lipsticks over the course of a lifetime an average woman actually ingests. And the ingestion would be actually through the oral route. So you basically, the same way you would eat your food. So yes, technically, we're all eating the one or the other lipstick over the course of our life. Do we need to be concerned about ingredients? One thing that I keep repeating, and for everyone who's heard this multiple times coming out of my mouth, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it again. If you're using cosmetic products that come from a legitimate source, that have been developed with a trained chemist that knows the regulations, you don't need to be worried about the safety of your cosmetic products. Companies that are legitimate, that make products that you can access in legitimate places, are required to be safe. And I genuinely do not think you need to be worried about. What you should be worried about is counterfeit products that you can buy on backyard markets, or you can buy online from clandestine sources that are made in facilities that aren't up to quality standards, utilizing ingredients that maybe aren't in line with quality standards. So do you need to be worried? Not if you're buying legitimate products from legitimate sources. And I try not to make blanket statements, but that one I'm quite confident with. Sorry.
So we had a comment that, especially you, Aegean, I would love for you to comment on. So the commenter said, products can absorb more if your stratum corneum is not functioning properly. That's true. So studies have shown that products can absorb more if the stratum corneum is not functioning more, for example. Oh, sorry, I'm just repeating the comment twice. So does that mean that we should? Yeah. Should we be concerned with our cosmetic products because of that? What do you think?
Well, this really applies mostly to people that have an underlying issue with their barrier function. So people with mild atopic dermatitis in general have a genetic defect in a protein called filaggrin. That's very important in maintaining our skin barrier function. So when you have a defect in that, your skin is inherently, you can almost think of it like the brick wall is a little bit more porous than it should be. So there are numerous studies that have shown that in patients with atopic dermatitis, the rate of allergic contact dermatitis reactions is higher. So that said, it's hard to make blanket statements because everybody's different. Everybody has different biologies. In general, as a physician, I would recommend, if you have atopic dermatitis or some other issue with your skin barrier, ichthyosis, psoriasis, try to use products that are made by larger companies because they have been subjected to more rigorous testing and generally are not so fragrance heavy, kind of more geared towards clinical use. So brands that, I usually recommend to patients are, and I don't have any commercial interest, but, Cetaphil, CeraVe, Vanicream, all of those brands tend to be pretty simple, not as many fragrances. Specifically with eczema patients, we try to stay away from lanolin containing products. I know Aquaphor does have a fragment of lanolin, which they've shown in their studies isn't as allergenic as the native lanolin protein. So, it really depends on the person. And if you do tend to have sensitive skin, because some people do have mild kind of subclinical eczema or atopic dermatitis, I usually recommend, if you're going to try a new product, instead of smearing it all over your face, maybe try it on a small patch of skin behind your ear for a week or so and see if you have any reaction to it. And if you do, then you'll move on. And that's kind of a quick and dirty way for you to do something yourself. But if you keep having an ongoing rash that you're not sure where it's coming from, you may benefit from a patch test, and this is different from the blood test they do at the allergist, but this is where actually patches of different ingredients are applied to your back. And I know some companies will do this for their products prior to launch, some version of this kind of testing where we actually can interpret and see if you have a true reaction to specific ingredients.
Just to chime in on like a less irritation and more toxicity angle. So I think, I think some people are worried about things like applying sunscreen on broken skin and stuff like that. And I think what is like less known about how cosmetic chemists, how toxicologists and regulators set limits on, like recommended limits on products, is that there is usually a giant margin of error in terms of toxicity. So they will work out how dangerous a particular ingredient is based on animal studies and so on. They estimate how dangerous it is for humans, and then they set the limit like hundreds, thousands, millions of times lower than the accepted safe level. So with that sort of margin of error, even if you have broken skin, you are not absorbing hundreds of times more chemicals through that broken skin than through normal skin. Like it's like, again, skin, even if skin is broken, it is still not that permeable, like not to that extent that it'll negate that margin of error.
We had so many great questions. Anke, just let us know when you're ready to go to bed.
I was ready an hour ago.
Do you mind
I noticed you got quieter throughout the call.
Sorry.
The issue of us all being in very different places, but technology, it's an amazing thing that we can have people across the globe connecting. I guess I'll ask maybe 2 more questions if that's okay. Is that okay? Okay. So this next question comes from Esty, and she asks, do you think these potentially irritating ingredients such as SLS can be triggers for people with genetic immune disorders and compromised immune systems? Does anyone want to chime in on that?
I can comment on it. So that kind of mixes in some pseudoscience concepts, I think. So, you know, our immune systems are extremely complex. So it's important to kind of understand the different types of compartments. So our skin has its own immune system. So really anybody can develop an allergic contact dermatitis. I guess you can think of it as an alteration in your immune system, but it's just your immune system doing its job. And for reasons unknown, certain people can develop certain allergies to things. But if you have an internal issue with your immune system, and again, it depends on what's going on. So if you have HIV, or if you've had an organ transplant and are taking immunosuppressive medications, or if you have, say, Crohn's disease or some other autoimmune disease like lupus, and you're taking immunosuppressives to manage that, it's very variable. I don't personally know of any association of those types of autoimmune disorders or patients that are immunocompromised with an increased rate of irritant or allergic contact dermatitis reactions on the skin. Again, this is a very general answer, and it really depends on the disease. Things like psoriasis can be linked to metabolic issues, cardiac issues, endocrine issues like diabetes, and those are kind of all genetically linked. But just in terms of somebody that has some immune alteration being more susceptible to products on your skin, that's not something I generally consider to be linked. Again, unless you have something like atopic dermatitis or ichthyosis or some other barrier issue in terms of your skin function. I hope that answered the question. It was kind of a broad question, but.
And so Lee Loves Makeup asks, consumers say that they prefer natural over chemicals, but isn't everything a chemical? What do you think about this idea?
Yes.
I'll just maybe make a statement. This is something that really drives me crazy when I see companies claiming that they're chemical free. I guess when I see that on a label, it kind of, to me, it's just them putting it on a flag, waving it around and saying, I have no idea about the science of my product, or like, I don't know what I'm talking about. If you think that things can be, products at least can be chemical free. I don't know. Would you guys agree with me for that?
Yes.
Yes.
And I
think
guess
it was the Royal Society of Chemistry that put
yeah.
out like a bounty on the person, or put out money for the person that can actually formulate a chemical-free product. Like, I think they're awarding so and so much money if you can actually do that, because they know it's not possible.
I think there was a paper, like a joke paper that was published, and it was like a comprehensive list of all chemical-free products, and it was just empty.
Okay, so actually my final question, do you have any final take-homes that you'd like to leave everyone with? There's a lot of things that we haven't covered. Some of the questions that came up range from like, how can we change things around and make this movement a little bit more productive? But anyways, that was just one of the comments that came up. Do you have any final take-homes that you'd like to leave our audience with?
I guess I could start. I mean, I think with all these discussions that we've been having in the community of scientists and physicians in our kind of sphere, I feel like the tide might be turning towards transparency. And I know that personally, I've had a lot of comments from followers and readers that have really appreciated all the knowledge collectively that we've put out, because they feel more empowered instead of having to just rely on the don't buy this, but actually understanding the science and the reasoning behind certain ingredients and why they're in products. I think the consumer, for the most part, is intelligent and wants to have more autonomy over the decisions they're making. So I'm hoping that transparency will become, will kind of replace the clean beauty movement, and that information that we've been talking about will be more accessible to the consumer. Testing data, safety data, what tests have actually been done on the product, and keeping companies accountable for that. And then when I was kind of doing some research on these topics, a couple of resources came up that I thought might be useful, because I think that's also difficult. How do you sort through, when you Google something, how do you sort through what's legitimate and what's not? I actually think the FDA website is pretty helpful. They have a whole page about parabens that's written out in in language that's really easily to understand. So questions about regulation, certain ingredients, I think the FDA actually is a pretty good resource. And then the cosmetic ingredient review I was reading, and I don't know if you guys have utilized it, but it is an alternative to the EWG. It's a little bit dense because they have these long reports where they have all the data outlined in terms of safety of different ingredients. But that is also another resource that I came across that I think would be useful to people looking for an alternative.
Anke, do you want to go next?
Sure. I think one thing that's very close to my heart, and that I think would be great if discussions like this could, give the incentive to foster that thinking with consumers, is to look into concentrations. Look, if you're interested in what's safe for you, what's good for you, what's bad for you. Try to get an understanding of what different concentrations are and how different concentrations can be either tested or used in a product, and what that means for you when you use a product. We've touched on this on a couple of occasions. If something is a pure chemical and it's applied to your skin under a patch, that would give different results compared to the same chemical being in a 10% solution just in water or alcohol applied to your skin, or formulated in a product. Those are three very different scenarios that can lead to three very different results. And the same goes for how have ingredients been tested. So if somebody tells you this has been reported to have this and that effect, what did the publication actually say? What was the concentration? But then also, how has that concentration been tested? Was it in a cell culture experiment? Was it in an animal study? Was it on a human being? And then if in a human being, again, what was the concentration? How was it formulated? And how does that actually relate to your product? What is the concentration that is normally used in a product that you're using? So for example, coming back to SLS, average concentration in oral care is around 2 to 3%. The concentration that is used to simulate irritation on the skin is way higher and under a patch occlusion. So if I can leave a message after this discussion, go and look for concentrations, what's the formulation and how has it been applied, and what was the relevance in the study that has been presented to you.
Michelle, do you want to leave your...
Sure. So I think one of the things, like in addition to what Anke and Aegean have said, is to look at who the experts are. So look at who they are putting, like I guess the two sides are putting forward as their experts. Like, are they using celebrity spokespeople? Look at their qualifications. Look at what other experts they collaborate with. So I think if you have, like, of course there are going to be scientists and dermatologists who are pushing the clean beauty issue. But if you look at the number of people, the number of experts on each side, like I think that's a, I guess, very rough measure of how much expertise they have, like which side better represents what that particular topic says about a particular thing. So if you look at clean beauty, a lot of their spokespeople are celebrities. Why would, like, do they have a toxicology background? Have they collaborated with toxicologists? I think that is like a quick way of seeing which side is like more accurate.
Well, I hope everyone that stuck around for the hour and a half that could have easily gone into 2 to 3 hours. I could talk to you girls all night. So thank you so much for your time and your continued time on my platform. Just so everyone is aware, this conversation is going to be published right away on our YouTube channel, and eventually it's going to make its way onto our podcast. And if you're not already tuning in, you can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and most other streaming services at the EcoWell podcast. There were a number of questions that came up that we didn't have an opportunity to answer because we would have literally been talking all night or all morning or whatever time zone you're in. So leave them in the comments and we'll try our best to come back to them and answer them. But thank you everyone for tuning in. Also, I'll just say, if you're passionate about this topic of maybe spreading science and not misinformation, consider sharing this, or maybe sharing some of the content of the panelists that are here today. I chose them because I find them to be very credible sources on Instagram. If you're not already following, please do. But take it upon yourself to share accurate information, and maybe also like check the information before you share, but also share accurate information so that more of the science can start to maybe, I guess, overwhelm the pseudoscience that seems to be everywhere right now. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. Ending stream. I think I did it.